The fluorescent lights of St. Haven General Hospital hummed with their familiar, tireless drone. It was well past 2 in the morning, that peculiar hour when the world outside seemed to hold its breath, and inside the emergency ward, every sound carried weight. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air like a permanent resident, mingling with the faint metallic tang that always seemed to linger near the trauma bays. Richmond, Virginia wasn't known for its chaotic emergency rooms, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the atmosphere, a tension that Emily Carter couldn't quite name but felt deep in her bones. Emily had been working at St. Haven for exactly 32 days. She counted them not because she was proud, but because each shift felt like a small victory against the voice in her head that whispered she didn't belong. At 29 years old, she had somehow managed to convince herself that starting over was possible. New city, new job, new identity. The old Emily, whoever she had been, was buried somewhere she couldn't quite remember. And that was fine. That was exactly how she wanted it. She moved through the emergency department with practiced invisibility. Tray here, syringe there, a quiet nod to the attending physician who never bothered to learn her name. The senior nurses had already written her off as unremarkable, too quiet, too efficient, too willing to stay in the background. They didn't know that Emily preferred it that way. Being invisible meant being safe. Being forgettable meant surviving. The radio crackled at the nurses' station, and Emily's hands paused over the supply cabinet she was organizing. The dispatcher's voice was clipped, urgent, carrying that particular edge that meant something serious was coming. Multiple trauma. Unknown origin. ETA 3 minutes. The charge nurse, a weathered woman named Patricia who had seen everything twice, began barking orders. Emily felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something else, something familiar that she couldn't name. When the ambulance doors burst open at exactly 2:14 a.m., Emily was standing near the entrance, her hands already gloved, her mind already racing ahead. 2 paramedics pushed a gurney through with unusual speed, their faces tight with an expression she recognized. Not just urgency, fear, the kind of fear that came from encountering something you weren't supposed to see. The man on the gurney was covered in a blood-soaked sheet, but Emily could see enough. Navy uniform, torn and stained, 3 distinct wounds on his chest, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. His face was pale, nearly grey, and his breathing was shallow enough that each rise of his chest felt like a small miracle. No identification tags, no wallet, nothing but a small pendant around his neck, etched with a series of numbers that meant nothing to anyone looking, except Emily. Something about those numbers made her stomach clench. The trauma team descended on the patient with choreographed precision, but Emily could see immediately that they were losing him. The attending physician, a young man named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had graduated top of his class but had never dealt with anything like this, was calling for blood transfusions and surgical consults. But the chief surgeon was stuck across town, and the backup was 20 minutes away. 20 minutes this man did not have. Emily watched as the monitors screamed their warnings. Blood pressure dropping, heart rate erratic, internal bleeding that was filling his chest cavity with each passing second. The wounds weren't random, they were precise, calculated, designed to cause maximum damage without immediate termination. Whoever had done this wanted him to suffer, wanted him to have just enough time to know he was fading. Something shifted inside Emily. A door opened in her mind that she didn't know existed. Without conscious thought, she stepped forward. Her hands moved to the instrument tray, selecting tools with a certainty that surprised even her. The scalpel felt natural in her grip, an extension of her fingers rather than a foreign object. Dr. Webb was shouting something about protocols, about liability, about the fact that she was just a nurse and nurses didn't perform emergency thoracic surgery. But his voice seemed distant, muffled, like it was coming from underwater. Emily made the first incision. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady. She worked with a precision that seemed impossible for someone who had spent the last month doing nothing more complicated than changing IV bags. The first projectile came out cleanly, dropped into the waiting basin with a metallic ping. Then the second, then the third, each one intact, unmarked, as if they had been designed specifically to be recovered. The bleeding stopped. The monitors settled into a rhythm that wasn't strong, but wasn't failing either. The man on the table was still alive. Against all odds, against everything that medicine said was possible, he was still alive. Emily stepped back from the table, her gloves covered in blood, her scrubs splattered with evidence of what she had just done. The entire trauma team was staring at her. Dr. Webb's mouth hung open, his protests dying in his throat. Patricia had gone pale, her experienced eyes wide with something that looked almost like recognition. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor, counting out the seconds of a life that should have ended. Emily sealed the 3 projectiles in a sterile container, labeled it with trembling hands that had been so steady just moments before, and set it aside. Then she stripped off her gloves, disposed of them properly, and walked back to her station as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just performed a miracle, as if she hadn't just revealed a secret that she herself didn't understand. Behind her, the man on the gurney was being wheeled to the ICU. His vital signs were weak but stable. His identity was still unknown. But somewhere in his sedated mind, in whatever dreams or nightmares were flickering behind his closed eyes, a name surfaced. A name he had been forbidden to speak for 5 years. A name that belonged to the woman who had just saved his life for the second time. The first time had been in a desert, under a sky full of stars and the sound of helicopter blades, in a place that officially didn't exist, during a mission that had never happened. But Emily didn't remember that. Not yet. The memories were coming, though, rising from whatever deep place they had been buried. And when they finally surfaced, nothing about her quiet, invisible life would ever be the same again. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. In less than an hour, the FBI would arrive. In less than 2 hours, Emily Carter would learn that her entire life was a carefully constructed lie. And in less than 3 hours, she would have to make a choice that would determine not just her future, but the futures of everyone she had unknowingly left behind. The night was far from over. It was only just beginning. The FBI arrived at 5:23 a.m. Just as the first grey light of dawn was beginning to seep through the hospital windows. They came without sirens, without fanfare, with the kind of quiet authority that suggested they had done this many times before. 3 black SUVs pulled into the emergency bay, and 8 agents emerged with synchronized precision. They didn't run, they didn't need to. Their very presence seemed to slow time, to command attention, to make everyone in their vicinity suddenly aware that something much larger than a medical emergency was unfolding. Emily watched them from behind the nurse's station, her hands busy with paperwork that didn't need doing. She had learned long ago that looking busy was the best camouflage. People saw what they expected to see, and nobody expected a quiet nurse to be paying attention to federal agents. But she was paying attention, every detail, every movement, every glance they exchanged. The lead agent was a woman in her early 40s, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they touched. Her name was Samantha Hayes, though Emily wouldn't learn that for another hour. She walked with the measured confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating dangerous situations, someone who trusted her instincts because her instincts had kept her alive. When she entered the hospital, she didn't go to the front desk. She went straight to administration, as if she already knew exactly where to find what she was looking for. Within 30 minutes, the hospital was in lockdown. Not the kind of lockdown that came with announcements and explanations, but the quiet kind. The kind where suddenly no one could leave, where all phone calls were being monitored, where security guards who had spent years being friendly suddenly looked at everyone with suspicion. The official explanation was a federal investigation, details classified. The unofficial explanation was fear, pure, palpable fear. Emily kept working. She checked on patients, updated charts, made small talk with colleagues who were too distracted to notice how calm she was. But inside, her mind was racing. The man she had saved was now in the ICU, under guard by 2 agents who hadn't moved from their positions since arriving. His condition was stable but uncertain. His identity remained unknown to everyone except, apparently, the FBI. And the 3 projectiles she had extracted were no longer in the container where she had left them. She had noticed that immediately. The container was still there, still labeled in her handwriting, but it was empty. Someone had taken the contents within the brief window between when she had left the trauma bay and when she had returned. The surveillance footage from that period, she would later learn, showed nothing but static. Her convenient malfunction that lasted exactly 28 minutes. At 7:15 a.m., a junior agent approached Emily at her station. He was young, probably fresh out of Quantico, with the eager nervousness of someone trying very hard to appear professional. He asked her to follow him to conference room B. It wasn't a request. The conference room was small, windowless, designed for administrative meetings and awkward HR conversations. Agent Hayes was already there, sitting at the head of the table with a manila folder in front of her. She didn't stand when Emily entered. She simply gestured to the chair across from her, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Hayes studied Emily with those cataloguing eyes, taking in every detail, the way she sat, the way she held her hands, the way her breathing remained steady despite the circumstances. Emily met her gaze without flinching, without looking away, without showing any of the anxiety that a normal person in her situation would surely feel. Finally, Hayes opened the folder. Inside were photographs, documents, printouts of data that Emily couldn't read from her position. But she could see her own face looking back at her from one of the photographs, not a recent photo, an older one, from years ago, showing a version of herself she didn't recognize. The woman in the photo had shorter hair, sharper eyes, and was wearing tactical gear that Emily had never owned. Hayes spoke first. Her voice was measured, professional, but with an undertone of something that might have been curiosity. She explained that the man Emily had saved was not listed in any official database. His fingerprints matched no records. His DNA was not in any system, civilian or military. For all practical purposes, he did not exist. And yet someone had tried very hard to end his existence, using methods and weapons that suggested professional involvement. Emily listened without interrupting. Her face remained neutral, her hands still in her lap. Inside, memories were beginning to stir, like sediment disturbed at the bottom of a clear pond. Images flickered at the edges of her consciousness: a helicopter, a desert night, the smell of smoke and sand, a man's voice, telling her to stay down, to keep pressure on the wound, to not let go no matter what. Hayes continued. She explained that the surgery Emily had performed was not something a normal nurse could do. The techniques she had used, the precision she had demonstrated, suggested training that went far beyond civilian medical education. Training that, according to Emily's official records, she had never received. Her file said she had graduated from a nursing program in Ohio 3 years ago, had worked at 2 small hospitals before coming to St. Haven, had no military service, no special certifications, nothing that would explain what had happened in that trauma bay. And yet, Hayes said, leaning forward slightly, the FBI had records suggesting otherwise, records that were heavily classified, deeply buried, and officially didn't exist. Records that connected Emily Carter to something called the Orion Protocol. The name hit Emily like a physical force. Her vision blurred momentarily. The conference room seemed to shift around her, replaced for a split second by a different room, underground, lit by harsh fluorescent lights, filled with the sound of machinery and voices speaking in coded phrases. Then it was gone, and she was back in the hospital, staring at an FBI agent who was watching her reaction with intense interest. Emily asked what the Orion Protocol was. Her voice was steady, but something had changed in her eyes, something that Hayes noticed immediately. The agent closed the folder slowly. She explained that the Orion Protocol was a classified operation that had been officially terminated 5 years ago. It involved a specialized unit of agents, medical personnel, and support staff who operated outside normal channels. Their mission parameters were sealed. Their identities were erased. When the protocol was shut down, everyone involved was supposed to disappear. Most did. Some didn't have a choice. But a few, Hayes said, were given new identities, new lives, new memories, carefully constructed to replace the ones that were too dangerous to keep. They were scattered across the country, living ordinary lives, unaware of who they had been. Emily Carter, she said, was one of those people. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Emily wanted to deny it, to laugh it off as some kind of mistake. But the memories were coming faster now, breaking through whatever barriers had held them back. Faces she recognized but couldn't name, skills she possessed but couldn't explain. A life that felt like it had been lived by someone else, someone she was only now beginning to remember. And somewhere in the ICU, the man she had saved was waking up. The man who knew her real name. The man who could tell her everything she had forgotten. If they let him live long enough to speak, Logan Reed opened his eyes at 9:47 a.m., 3 hours after the FBI had taken control of the hospital. The first thing he saw was a white ceiling, marked with the familiar tiles of a medical facility. The second thing he saw was the face of a federal agent, staring down at him with an expression that mixed professional concern with barely concealed suspicion. Logan had seen that look before, in countless interrogation rooms across 3 continents. It meant that whoever was asking the questions didn't expect to believe the answers. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the combination of sedation and trauma. 3 holes in his chest, each one carefully stitched and bandaged, reminded him with every breath that he was lucky to be breathing at all. The last thing he remembered before the darkness was a parking garage in Arlington, the flash of muzzle fire, the impact that had thrown him against his car, then pain, then nothing. Until now. Until a hospital room in Richmond, surrounded by people who wanted to know things he couldn't tell them. The agent introduced himself as Special Agent Morrison. He asked Logan a series of standard questions: name, date of birth, address, occupation. Logan answered none of them, not because he was being difficult, but because the answers he could give were lies, and the answers that were true were classified beyond anything this agent had clearance to know. So he simply stared at the ceiling and waited for someone with actual authority to arrive. That someone came 30 minutes later. Agent Samantha Hayes entered the room with the quiet confidence of a person who had read every file, analyzed every angle, and already knew most of what she was going to ask. She dismissed Morrison with a look, pulled a chair close to Logan's bedside, and sat down with the folder she had been carrying all morning. She told Logan that she knew who he was. Not the cover identity he had been using for the past 3 years, but his real name, his real history, his real purpose. She knew about the operations he had run in places that didn't appear on any map, knew about the lives he had saved and the lives he had ended, knew about the protocol that had bound him to silence and the day that silence had been broken. Logan listened without reacting. His training held even in his weakened state. Show nothing, admit nothing. Wait for the opportunity that would eventually come. But Hayes wasn't interested in interrogating him. She was interested in warning him. She explained that his survival had created a problem. The people who had ordered his elimination believed he was carrying information that could destroy careers, end political futures, expose operations that had been buried for years. They didn't care that he had never intended to use that information, that he had kept his silence faithfully for half a decade. His mere existence was a threat, and now that he had survived what was supposed to be a definitive solution, they would try again. Logan asked who she meant by they. Hayes smiled grimly and said that was the question everyone wanted answered. She then asked about the nurse, the young woman who had performed the emergency surgery that saved his life. Logan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Memory. A name that surfaced through the fog of sedation, like a light glimpsed through deep water. Emily, he said. Her name was Emily. Hayes nodded. She asked how he knew that. Logan was silent for a long moment, weighing his options, calculating risks. Then he spoke, his voice rough from the tube that had been removed from his throat just an hour before. He told Hayes about Orion. Not everything, but enough. He explained that the protocol had involved a team of specialists, people whose skills were too valuable and too dangerous to exist in official records. Some were operators like him, trained for combat and infiltration. Others were different. Medics, analysts, engineers, people who could do impossible things and then vanish without a trace. Emily had been one of the medics, the best he had ever seen. During a failed extraction in a hostile territory, when their helicopter had been shot down and half the team was wounded, she had kept them alive. For 3 days, in a bombed-out building with minimal supplies, She had performed surgeries that shouldn't have been possible. She had saved Logan's life then, pulling fragments from his abdomen with nothing but a combat knife and steady hands. He had never forgotten her face, even after they told him she was gone. Gone, Hayes repeated. What did that mean? Logan explained that when Orion was terminated, the surviving members were given a choice. Some chose to disappear on their own terms. Others were disappeared by the people who wanted to ensure their silence, and a few, the ones considered too valuable to eliminate, but too dangerous to leave intact, were given new identities. Their memories were altered, suppressed through techniques that Logan didn't fully understand. They were scattered across the country, living lives they didn't know were false. Emily had been one of those. Logan had seen her file years ago when he was trying to find the other survivors. He had tracked her to Ohio, then to Virginia, watching from a distance to make sure she was safe. He had never approached her, never reminded her of who she had been. Some things, he believed, were better left buried. But now, the burial was over. The people who had tried to eliminate him knew about Emily too. They had to. The surgery she performed, the skills she demonstrated, would have triggered every alert in every database that monitored the Orion survivors. By saving his life, she had signed her own potential end. Hayes absorbed this information with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to impossible revelations. She asked Logan what the attackers were really after. Not him, specifically, but the information he supposedly carried. Logan hesitated. Then he told her about the projectiles. They weren't ordinary ammunition. They were specially designed, containing microcircuits embedded in their casings. Those circuits held data, heavily encrypted files that contained evidence of operations that had violated international law, evidence that could bring down senators, generals, intelligence officials, evidence that had been smuggled out of the Middle East in the only way that couldn't be detected, hidden inside the body of a wounded operative. The data had been meant for people who could use it responsibly: journalists, investigators, oversight committees. But before Logan could deliver it, he had been intercepted. The people who wanted that information buried had found him first, and now the projectiles were missing. Hayes told him that the container Emily had prepared was empty when the FBI arrived. Someone had taken the contents, and whoever it was had known exactly when and how to do it without being caught. Logan's jaw tightened. He asked about Emily, where she was, whether she was safe. Hayes told him she was still in the hospital, still being questioned, still unaware of the full scope of what she had stumbled into. "We need to find those projectiles," Hayes said. "And we need to protect that nurse, before whoever is behind this decides to tie up all the loose ends." Logan looked at her with eyes that had seen too much to trust easily. He asked why the FBI cared. What made this their problem, instead of just another classified mess to be swept under another classified rug? Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then she told him something she probably shouldn't have. She had a personal stake in this case. Years ago, before she joined the FBI, she had been part of a congressional investigation into unauthorized military operations. The investigation had been shut down, the evidence destroyed, the witnesses silenced. She had spent her entire career waiting for another chance to expose the truth. This, she said, might be that chance. Logan studied her face, looking for deception, finding only determination. He made a decision that went against every instinct his training had given him. "All right," he said, "I'll help you. But first, you need to let me talk to Emily. She deserves to know what she's gotten into, and she deserves to remember who she really is." Hayes nodded slowly. That, she said, was exactly what she had been planning to arrange. Emily sat alone in the break room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their pale glow over the worn furniture and faded motivational posters that decorated the walls. It was nearly noon, and she hadn't slept in over 30 hours, but exhaustion seemed like a distant concept now, something far less immediate than the questions racing through her mind. The FBI agent, Hayes, had told her things that shouldn't have been possible. An entire life she didn't remember. Skills she possessed but couldn't explain. A past that had been deliberately erased, replaced with manufactured memories so convincing that she had never questioned them. Emily wanted to dismiss it as some kind of elaborate mistake, a case of mistaken identity, a bureaucratic error in classified files. But she couldn't, because deep down, in places she had never allowed herself to explore, she had always known something was wrong. The dreams had been the first sign. For years, she had been plagued by vivid nightmares that felt more like memories than imagination. Desert landscapes stretching to infinite horizons, the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through hot air, voices speaking in languages she didn't consciously know but somehow understood, faces of people she had never met, looking at her with trust and recognition and something that might have been love. She had always dismissed those dreams as stress, as the brain's way of processing random information, but now she wondered if they were something else entirely. Windows into a past that had been sealed away but never truly destroyed. The door to the break room opened, and Emily looked up to see Agent Hayes standing in the doorway. Her expression was difficult to read, but there was something softer in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there during their earlier conversation. Hayes told Emily that there was someone who wanted to see her, someone who might be able to help her understand what was happening. Emily asked who. Hayes simply stepped aside, revealing the figure of a man in a hospital gown, leaning heavily on a cane that one of the orderlies had found for him. Logan Reed looked nothing like the blood-soaked figure who had arrived on that gurney hours before. His face was still pale, still marked with the evidence of trauma, but his eyes were clear and focused. They fixed on Emily with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Not hostile, not threatening. Something else entirely. Recognition. Deep, profound, heartbreaking recognition. He spoke her name. Not Emily. Another name. A name that echoed through the empty corridors of her erased memories and made something deep inside her shatter. Sarah. The word hit her like a physical blow. Images flooded her mind, breaking through whatever barriers had held them back. A military base in a country she couldn't name. Training exercises that pushed her body and mind to their limits. A team of people who became her family, closer than any blood relation she had ever known. And this man, younger then, less scarred, looking at her across a briefing room table with eyes full of the same recognition she saw now. Emily, or Sarah, or whoever she was, felt tears streaming down her face. She didn't know why she was crying. She didn't know what she was mourning. But the grief was overwhelming, a tsunami of emotion breaking over walls that had held strong for 5 years. Logan crossed the room slowly, each step clearly costing him significant pain. When he reached her, he didn't embrace her, didn't try to touch her. He simply sat down in the chair across from her and waited for her to process, waited for her to remember, waited for her to decide who she wanted to be. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She asked him to tell her everything, and he did. He told her about the Orion Protocol, about the team they had been part of, about the missions they had run together. He told her about the extraction that went wrong, about the 3 days they had spent trapped in hostile territory, about the moment when she had saved his life with nothing but determination and skill. He told her about the day the protocol was terminated, about the chaos and fear and the desperate choices everyone had made, and he told her about what had been done to her. How the decision had been made, by people with more authority than conscience, that certain members of the team were too valuable to lose but too dangerous to remain intact. How they had developed techniques, experimental and ethically questionable, to suppress memories and implant new ones. How she had been given a new identity, a new history, a new life that felt so real she had never questioned it. Emily listened without interrupting. The coffee in her hands had been forgotten, set aside on the table between them. Her mind was a battlefield now, the new memories warring with the old, reality shifting and reforming like sand in a windstorm. She asked why. Why had they done this to her? Why not just let her disappear like the others? Logan's expression darkened. He explained that she had possessed something they wanted to preserve, not just her medical skills, though those were remarkable. There was something else, something she had taken from their last mission, information that she had memorized, data that existed nowhere else, details about operations that could never be allowed to become public. They had wiped her conscious memories, but they had kept her alive in case they ever needed to retrieve what she knew. Emily felt sick. The realization that she had been treated as a storage device, a container for dangerous secrets, made her want to scream. But she kept her voice steady, her training, or what remained of it, kicking in despite herself. She asked what information she was carrying. What could possibly be worth erasing an entire person to protect? Logan shook his head. He said he didn't know everything, only fragments, but he knew it involved operations that had violated every law, every treaty, every principle the country claimed to uphold. Operations that continued to this day, protected by people with enough power to make problems disappear. People, he added quietly, who were now aware that both of them were still alive. Agent Hayes, who had been standing silently by the door throughout this conversation, spoke up. She told them that the hospital was still in lockdown, but it wouldn't last forever. The people responsible for the attack on Logan had resources and connections that even the FBI couldn't fully counter. If they wanted to survive, if they wanted any chance at exposing the truth, they needed to act quickly. Emily looked from Hayes to Logan and back again. These were strangers, technically, people she had just met, in lives she was only beginning to remember. But something deeper than conscious memory told her she could trust them, told her that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. She stood up, her legs steadier than she expected. The fear was still there, the confusion, the grief for a life she was only now realizing she had lost. But underneath all of that, something else was emerging. Something that felt like strength. "All right," she said. "Tell me what we need to do." And for the first time since that gurney had burst through the emergency doors, Emily Carter began to remember who Sarah Mitchell really was. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows as the lockdown entered its 8th hour. Staff members moved through the corridors with increasing unease, their whispered conversations creating a constant undertone of anxiety that permeated every floor. The FBI agents maintained their positions at key checkpoints, their presence a reminder that whatever was happening extended far beyond a simple medical emergency. But not everyone in those dark suits was working toward the same goal. Cole Mercer arrived at 3:47 p.m., stepping out of a black sedan that pulled up to the hospital's main entrance with deliberate authority. Unlike the other agents, who at least attempted to blend into their surroundings, Mercer made no such effort. He walked like a man who expected doors to open before him, like someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. His credentials identified him as a senior federal agent, but the look in his eyes suggested something far more specific, something that made even the FBI agent step aside without asking questions. Agent Hayes saw him first, through the window of the conference room where she had been coordinating the investigation. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a reaction so subtle that only someone watching closely would have noticed. She excused herself from her conversation and intercepted Mercer in the main hallway, her posture shifting into something more guarded, more prepared. Mercer greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He explained that he had been sent to assist with the investigation, that his superiors were concerned about the lack of progress in identifying the people responsible for the attack. His tone was cordial, professional, but underneath the words was a threat that Hayes recognized immediately. He wasn't here to help. He was here to clean up, and anyone who got in his way would become part of the mess. Hayes maintained her composure, matching his professional veneer with her own. She explained that the investigation was proceeding according to protocol, that the patient was stable and cooperating, that they expected significant progress within the next 24 hours. Mercer nodded along, his eyes scanning the corridor behind her, cataloging exits, personnel, potential obstacles. Then he asked about the nurse, the one who had performed the emergency surgery. He said he needed to interview her, standard procedure for anyone who had been in direct contact with the patient. His voice remained pleasant, but there was something in the way he said needed that made Hayes's skin crawl. She told him the nurse was resting, having been on duty for over 30 hours. She could be made available for questioning in the morning. Mercer smiled again, that same empty expression, and said that would be acceptable. Then he walked away, disappearing into the maze of corridors as if he already knew exactly where he was going. Hayes waited until he was out of sight, then immediately changed direction. She needed to find Emily and Logan, needed to warn them that the situation had just become significantly more dangerous. But as she rounded the corner toward the east wing, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. 4 words that made her blood run cold. He knows about Sarah. Emily was in Logan's hospital room when Hayes arrived, the two of them deep in conversation about memories that were continuing to surface. The process of remembering was painful, like removing bandages from wounds that had never fully healed. But with each recovered fragment, Emily was becoming more herself, more complete, more capable of understanding what she needed to do. Hayes closed the door behind her and delivered the news without preamble. Cole Mercer was in the building. He was one of the cleaners, the people sent in when situations became too messy for conventional solutions. His presence meant that whoever was orchestrating this operation had decided that containment was no longer sufficient. They wanted elimination. Logan's expression hardened at the name. He knew Mercer by reputation, if not by personal encounter. The man was a ghost in intelligence circles, a rumor that agents shared in hushed tones when discussing operations that had gone particularly wrong. He had no official existence, no traceable history, no accountability. He simply appeared when problems needed to disappear and then vanished again, leaving nothing but silence in his wake. Emily felt the fear rising in her chest, but alongside it came something else. Anger. She was tired of being a victim, tired of being a piece on someone else's board, tired of having her life stolen and rewritten by people who treated human beings as expendable resources. Whatever was coming, she was done running. Hayes told them they needed to leave the hospital. She had contacts who could provide safe transportation, a location where they could regroup and plan their next move. But getting out wouldn't be easy. Mercer would be watching all the exits, and the lockdown meant limited options for quiet departure. Logan struggled to his feet, wincing at the pain that shot through his chest, but refusing to let it stop him. He said he knew another way out, a maintenance tunnel that connected to the building's old heating system. It had been used during construction and never properly sealed. If they could reach the basement without being spotted, they could make it to the street. Emily looked at him, then at Hayes, then at the door that separated them from whatever was waiting beyond. She asked what happened after they escaped. Where did they go? What did they do? How did 3 people, 2 of them wounded, and one of them barely beginning to remember who she was, stand against an organization powerful enough to erase entire lives? Hayes met her eyes with steady determination. She said that the answer was in the projectiles, in the information they contained. If they could recover that data, they would have leverage, evidence, something that couldn't be ignored or destroyed or swept away. The people behind this had survived for decades by keeping their secrets hidden. The moment those secrets became public, their power would evaporate. But first, they needed to find out who had taken the projectiles from the hospital. Someone on the inside, someone with access and motive and the knowledge of exactly what they were taking. That person was either an ally or an enemy, and identifying which would determine everything that came next. Emily thought about the morning, about the chaos and confusion of those early hours. She thought about who had been present, who had opportunity, who had behaved in ways that didn't quite fit. And then she remembered something. A face in the crowd. A figure moving against the flow of traffic. A person who shouldn't have been there but somehow was. Dr. Marcus Webb, the young physician who had tried to stop her from performing the surgery. She had dismissed him at the time as simply overwhelmed, simply following protocol. But now she remembered the way he had looked at her. Not with shock, with recognition, with the same kind of recognition she had seen in Logan's eyes. She shared her suspicion with the others. Hayes nodded slowly, pulling up records on her phone. Webb's file was clean, almost suspiciously so. Perfect grades, perfect record, no red flags of any kind. The kind of file that was created, not earned. They had their first lead. Now they just needed to survive long enough to follow it. The basement of St. Haven General was a labyrinth of forgotten spaces and abandoned equipment, a museum of medical practices that had long since been replaced by modern techniques. Emily led the way through narrow corridors, lit only by the occasional flickering bulb, her newly recovered memories guiding her with an instinct she was only beginning to trust. Behind her, Logan moved with difficulty but determination. His injuries, a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Hayes brought up the rear, her weapon drawn, her eyes scanning every shadow for signs of pursuit. The maintenance tunnel was exactly where Logan had said it would be, a rusted access door hidden behind a stack of broken gurneys. Emily worked the lock with surprising skill, another gift from her buried past, and within minutes they were moving through the narrow passage beneath the hospital. The air was stale and cold, carrying the smell of damp concrete and decades of neglect, but it was freedom, or at least the path to it. They emerged into an alley 3 blocks from the hospital, the afternoon sun shockingly bright after the darkness of the tunnel. Hayes made a phone call, speaking in clipped phrases that conveyed urgency without panic, and within 20 minutes, a nondescript van had arrived to collect them. The driver was a woman Emily didn't recognize, middle-aged with kind eyes and steady hands, who asked no questions and offered no conversation. The safe house was a modest suburban home on the outskirts of Richmond, the kind of place that disappeared into its surroundings through sheer ordinariness. Inside, however, it was equipped with technology that belied its unremarkable exterior. Secure communications, surveillance monitors, encrypted databases. Hayes explained that this was a bureau asset, used for witness protection and high-risk operations. For now, it would serve as their base of operations. Emily helped Logan to a couch, where he immediately began reviewing files that Hayes had compiled on Dr. Marcus Webb. The young physician had arrived at St. Haven 8 months ago, taking a position in the emergency department, despite being qualified for more prestigious placements. His previous hospital had closed suddenly, its records conveniently lost in a fire that investigators had ruled accidental. His references had been glowing, but, upon closer examination, came from people who were difficult to contact or verify. The picture was becoming clearer. Webb was a plant, inserted into the hospital for purposes that were only now becoming apparent. But was he working with the people trying to eliminate Logan and Emily, or against them? The fact that he had taken the projectiles suggested he knew their value. The question was what he intended to do with that knowledge. Hayes stepped away to make more calls, leaving Emily and Logan alone for the first time since the break room. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the weight of shared history that was finally beginning to feel real again. Emily had so many questions, so many gaps in her memory that still needed filling. But she started with the one that mattered most. She asked Logan why he had never tried to help her remember. In all those years of watching from a distance, why hadn't he approached her, told her who she really was, given her back what had been taken? Logan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the files in his hands without really seeing them. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years of difficult decisions. He said that he had wanted to, more times than he could count. There had been nights when he had driven past her apartment, watching her lights, wondering what she was doing, who she was becoming. He had written letters he never sent, made plans he never executed, but he had stopped himself every time, because the life she had built, false though its foundations might have been, was real to her. She had friends, a career, a sense of purpose that seemed genuine even if its origins were manufactured. Who was he to destroy all of that? To tear away the comfort of her constructed reality and force her to confront a past full of pain and danger and loss? He had told himself it was better this way, that she deserved peace, even if it was a peace built on lies, that remembering would only bring her suffering, without offering any hope of resolution. But now, he admitted, he wondered if he had been wrong, if protecting her from the truth had actually been protecting himself from the guilt of what he had failed to do. They had been more than colleagues once, more than teammates. There had been something between them that neither had been willing to name, a connection that had survived desert nights and impossible odds and the constant shadow of their uncertain lives. And then it had been taken away, not by choice, but by force. By people who saw human connection as a vulnerability to be exploited or eliminated. Emily listened to his words, feeling the truth of them resonate with memories she was still recovering. She remembered now. Not everything, but enough. She remembered the way he had looked at her during those long nights in hostile territory, the way his hand had found hers in the darkness when the sounds of danger drew close. The unspoken promise they had made to each other, that if they survived, they would find a way to build something real. That promise had been broken by forces beyond their control. But maybe, she thought, it wasn't too late to keep it. She didn't say any of this out loud. The moment wasn't right, and there was too much still unresolved. But she reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything they had lost and everything they might still find. Hayes returned with news that shifted their focus back to the immediate crisis. Her contacts had located Dr. Webb. He wasn't hiding, wasn't running. He was at his apartment, apparently waiting. Either he was supremely confident in his safety, or he wanted to be found. Either way, they needed to talk to him. The decision was made quickly. Hayes would approach first, establish contact, assess whether Webb was a threat or a potential ally. Emily and Logan would provide backup, staying close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to avoid spooking him. It was risky. Everything about this situation was risky. But they were running out of time and options, and the only way forward was through. As they prepared to leave, Emily felt a strange calm settling over her. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, the grief for everything she had lost. But alongside those emotions was something new, or rather something old that she was finally remembering. The feeling of having a mission, of knowing what needed to be done and being willing to do it, of being part of something larger than herself. She was Sarah Mitchell again, not just in name, but in spirit, and she was ready to fight. Doctor. Marcus Webb's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better days, its facade weathered by years of Richmond summers and winters. Hayes approached the front entrance alone, her credentials ready, her manner professional. The other tenants she passed on the stairs paid her little attention, absorbed in their own evening routines, just another visitor in a building full of transient lives. Webb opened the door before she could knock, as if he had been watching for her arrival. He was younger than she had expected from his file, with the tired eyes of someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. When he saw her badge, he simply nodded and stepped aside, inviting her in without a word. The apartment was sparsely furnished, temporary in that way that suggested its occupant had never intended to stay. But what caught Hayes's attention immediately was the equipment arranged on the kitchen table. Sophisticated electronics, encryption devices, communication gear that would be right at home in the intelligence facility, and sitting in the center of it all, a sealed container that looked remarkably similar to the one Emily had used to store the projectiles. Webb saw her looking and answered before she could ask. He said that, yes, he had taken them. He apologized for the deception, explained that there hadn't been time to identify allies in the chaos of that morning. When he had seen Emily perform that surgery, he had recognized her immediately. Sarah Mitchell, the medic from Orion, the woman everyone thought had been erased completely. He had known then that the situation was about to become very complicated. The projectiles contained data that multiple parties wanted for very different reasons. Leaving them in the hospital had been too risky, so he had done what he was trained to do. He had secured the asset and waited to see who would come looking. Hayes asked who he was really working for. His file said FBI, but his equipment said something else entirely. Webb hesitated, then made a decision that clearly cost him something. He said he was originally Orion, like Emily and Logan. A different division, focused on information warfare rather than field operations. When the protocol was terminated, he had managed to avoid the memory restructuring by being overseas, by being forgotten in the chaos of shutdown. He had spent the years since trying to understand what had happened, who had given the orders, where the other survivors had ended up. He had taken the position at St. Haven because he knew Emily was there. He had been watching her, just as Logan had, waiting to see if her memories would ever resurface naturally. When the wounded man arrived and she performed that impossible surgery, he had realized the waiting was over. Hayes processed this information rapidly. If Webb was telling the truth, he was an ally, someone who could help them understand the full scope of what they were facing. But trust didn't come easily in situations like this. She asked him to prove his loyalty, to give her something concrete. Webb walked to the kitchen table and opened the container. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were the 3 projectiles Emily had extracted. He picked one up carefully, holding it to the light. He explained that the data these contained was even more significant than Logan knew. It wasn't just evidence of past operations. It was proof of ongoing programs, current activities that continued to violate laws and treaties, names, dates, locations. Everything needed to expose the entire network. But there was more. He set the projectile down and pulled up something on his computer, a file that had been hidden within the encrypted data, a file that nobody had known existed until Webb had begun decrypting the contents. The file was a list. Names of every surviving Orion operative, their current locations, their assumed identities. Information that had been gathered by someone inside the organization responsible for the protocol's termination. Information that explained how Logan had been found, how his attackers had known exactly where he would be. There was a traitor, someone who had been part of Orion, someone who had survived the shutdown, someone who was now working with the people trying to eliminate the remaining witnesses. And according to the file, that person was coming to Richmond, was perhaps already here. Hayes felt the weight of this revelation settle over her. They weren't just fighting an organization. They were fighting one of their own, someone who knew their methods, their weaknesses, their capabilities. She asked Webb who it was. His expression grew dark as he pulled up another image on his computer. The face on the screen was familiar. A woman Emily's age, with sharp features and calculating eyes, someone who had been mentioned in the files Hayes had reviewed earlier. Someone who was supposed to have been among those whose memories had been erased. Dr. Catherine Moore, Orion's chief medical officer, the person who had designed the memory suppression protocols, the person who had overseen Emily's transformation from Sarah Mitchell into Emily Carter. The traitor wasn't some anonymous bureaucrat or distant power broker. It was someone who had been intimately involved in every aspect of Orion, someone who understood the program from the inside out. Hayes's phone buzzed. A message from Emily, who was waiting with Logan in the vehicle outside. They had spotted movement on the street. Unfamiliar vehicles taking positions near the building's exits. They were no longer alone. Webb began gathering his equipment with practiced speed. He said they needed to move, that there was a secondary location where they could continue this conversation in safety. But Hayes hesitated, looking at the projectiles still sitting on the table. They couldn't leave those behind. Whatever happened next, that data was their only real leverage, the only thing that could protect them and expose the truth. She grabbed the container and headed for the door. Webb was right behind her, his computer bag over his shoulder, his expression grim but determined. Whatever differences might exist between them, whatever questions still needed answers, they were on the same side now. The corridor outside was quiet, but Hayes's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Too quiet, too empty. She signaled to Webb to stay close, then began moving toward the stairwell. They made it 3 steps before the lights went out. Darkness descended on the building like a physical weight, broken only by the red glow of emergency exit signs that flickered uncertainly in the corridor. Hayes moved on instinct, pressing against the wall, her weapon raised, her senses straining to detect any movement. Beside her, Webb had produced a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the black but also making them visible targets. Emily and Logan were outside, but the vehicles they had spotted suggested they wouldn't be able to reach the building. Hayes was on her own, at least for now. The attack came from both directions at once. Figures emerged from the stairwell and the elevator bay, moving with the coordinated precision of trained operatives. Hayes counted 6, maybe more, their faces obscured by tactical gear. They weren't trying to kill her. Not yet. They wanted the container she was carrying. She made a split-second decision. Tossing the container to Webb, she told him to run, to find another way out, to get the data to Emily no matter what. Then she turned to face the approaching figures, putting herself between them and their objective. The fight was brief and brutal. Hayes was skilled, but she was outnumbered and operating in near-total darkness. She managed to disable 2 of her attackers before someone caught her from behind, applying a chokehold that slowly drained the resistance from her limbs. Her last sight before consciousness faded was Webb disappearing around a corner, the container clutched against his chest. Emily saw the lights go out from the vehicle where she was waiting with Logan. She didn't hesitate. Ignoring his protests, she was out the door and moving toward the building before he could stop her. Whatever was happening inside, she wasn't going to sit safely and watch. The front entrance was blocked by one of the unknown vehicles, but Emily remembered something from her returning memories. A service entrance on the building's east side, used for deliveries and maintenance. She circled the structure, moving through shadows, her training guiding her steps even as her conscious mind struggled to keep up. The service door was locked, but a moment's work with the improvised tool solved that problem. Emily slipped inside, finding herself in a basement area filled with storage units and heating equipment. The sound of movement above her, boots on concrete, voices giving clipped orders. She was close. She found Webb on the second floor, cornered in a hallway with no exits. 3 operatives were closing in on him, their focus entirely on the container he still held. Emily didn't announce herself. She simply attacked, using the element of surprise and skills she was still rediscovering to disable the first operative before the others even realized she was there. The second went down quickly, a combination of strikes that her body remembered even if her mind was still catching up. The third managed to turn, managed to raise his weapon, but Webb had recovered enough to intervene, tackling the operative before he could fire. In the aftermath, Emily helped Webb to his feet, taking the container from his trembling hands. She asked if Hayes was all right. His expression answered before his words did. They found her on the 4th floor, unconscious but breathing, her face marked with bruises that would take weeks to heal. Emily checked her vitals with professional detachment, confirmed that she was stable, then helped Webb carry her to the stairs. Logan had disobeyed her instructions, of course. He was waiting at the service entrance, having found his own way to the building despite his injuries. Together, the 4 of them made their way to the vehicle, loading Hayes into the back and driving away before reinforcements could arrive. The safe house was no longer safe, that much was clear. But Webb knew another location, an apartment he had rented under an assumed name, a bolt hole he had prepared for exactly this kind of emergency. They drove in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Hayes regained consciousness as they arrived, her first words a demand for status on the container. Emily showed her that it was secure, that Webb had managed to save it despite everything. The relief on her face was visible even through the pain. Inside the apartment, Webb began setting up his equipment again, preparing to complete the decryption of the data. Logan sat heavily on a chair, his wounds protesting every movement. Emily stood by the window watching the street below, her mind processing everything that had happened. They had survived, but the enemy now knew exactly where they were going and what they had. The element of surprise was gone. Whatever move they made next would have to be their best one, because they might not get another chance. Hayes spoke from the couch where she was recovering. She said they needed to go public, to get the information out before it could be suppressed or destroyed. If they could reach the right journalists, the right investigators, they could start a cascade that no amount of power could stop. Webb agreed, but added a complication. Catherine Moore, the traitor, the architect of Emily's erased memories, was still out there. As long as she remained free, she could counter any narrative they tried to establish. She could discredit them, claim they were rogue operatives, plant false evidence that would muddy the waters beyond recognition. They needed to confront her, not to eliminate her, but to expose her, to bring her into the light where her crimes could be judged. Emily turned from the window. She said she would do it. Catherine had created Emily Carter, had stolen Sarah Mitchell's life and memories. If anyone had the right to face her, it was Emily. Logan started to protest, but she stopped him with a look. This wasn't his decision to make. It wasn't about revenge or anger, though she felt both of those things. It was about closure, about reclaiming the life that had been taken from her. Webb said he could arrange a meeting. Catherine would want to negotiate, to protect herself, to try to control the situation. If they approached her correctly, she might agree to talk. It was risky. Everything about this was risky. But they had come too far to stop now. Emily took a deep breath and made her decision. "Set it up," she said. "I'll be ready." The meeting place was a waterfront restaurant that had closed for the season, its outdoor seating covered with tarps and its windows dark. Catherine Moore had chosen it specifically. Emily knew, because it offered multiple exits and clear sight lines, a defensive position for someone who expected an attack. But Emily wasn't there to attack. She was there to end this. She arrived alone, as Catherine had demanded, leaving the others at a distance with instructions to intervene only if absolutely necessary. Her body was tense with anticipation, but her mind was clear. The memories that had returned over the past days had done more than remind her of who she used to be. They had shown her who she could become. Catherine was waiting inside, seated at a table that faced the entrance. She looked older than the photographs suggested, her face marked with the kind of lines that came from years of difficult choices and sleepless nights. When she saw Emily, something flickered in her eyes. Not surprise, recognition, resignation. Emily sat across from her without speaking. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything that had been done and everything that couldn't be undone. Catherine spoke first. She said she had known this day would come eventually, that secrets as big as theirs couldn't stay buried forever. She had spent years trying to manage the fallout, trying to contain the damage, trying to protect the people she could, while sacrificing those she couldn't. Emily asked why. Why had Catherine betrayed them? Why had she helped the people who wanted to eliminate the Orion survivors? Catherine's answer was more complicated than Emily had expected. She explained that when the protocol was terminated, the choice hadn't been between saving everyone or saving no one. It had been between saving some and losing all. The people giving the orders had wanted a complete purge, every operative, every support staff, every piece of evidence erased permanently. Catherine had negotiated, had convinced them that a gentler approach, memory restructuring instead of elimination, would be safer and more secure. Had personally overseen the procedures that transformed Sarah into Emily, that gave dozens of other operatives a chance at new lives they would never remember choosing. But the compromise had come with a price. Catherine had been forced to provide information, to identify operatives who refused the restructuring, to help hunt down those who tried to expose the truth. She had become the very thing she had tried to protect them from. Emily listened with a mixture of anger and something that might have been compassion. Catherine's choices had been terrible, had caused immeasurable suffering, but they had also, in their twisted way, saved lives, including Emily's own. That didn't make it right, but it made it understandable. Emily told Catherine that she had a choice now. She could continue to protect the people who had corrupted her, who had turned her into a weapon against her own colleagues. Or she could help expose them, could provide testimony and evidence that would end their power forever. The risk was enormous. The people behind this had resources and reach that extended into every level of government and industry. Coming forward meant painting a target on herself that would never be removed. But Emily added, it was also the only way Catherine could ever be free. The only way she could stop carrying the weight of everything she had done. Catherine was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant, her thoughts clearly traveling through years of difficult memories. Emily waited, knowing that this decision couldn't be rushed, that it had to come from somewhere genuine. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said yes, she would help them, she would testify, provide evidence, do whatever was necessary to bring the truth into the light. It wasn't absolution. Nothing could erase the suffering she had caused, but it was a beginning, a first step towards something that might, eventually, resemble redemption. The weeks that followed were chaotic and exhausting. The information from the projectiles, combined with Catherine's testimony, triggered investigations at multiple levels. Senators resigned, generals faced courts-martial, intelligence officials found themselves under scrutiny they had never expected. The full scope of the Orion Protocol and its aftermath became public knowledge, sparking debates about accountability and oversight that would continue for years. Emily testified before congressional committees, her recovered memories providing crucial details that no other source could offer. Logan stood beside her through every hearing, every interview, every difficult conversation. Their relationship, interrupted by forces beyond their control, had found its way back to life. Hayes received commendation for her role in exposing the conspiracy, though she cared more about the results than the recognition. Webb disappeared back into the intelligence community, his skills too valuable to leave unused, but on terms he could accept. And Catherine faced judgment for her actions, accepting responsibility with a dignity that surprised everyone who knew her history. Her cooperation had mitigated her sentence, but more importantly, it had begun the process of healing wounds that had festered for far too long. Emily stood on the steps of the Capitol building after her final testimony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The past months had changed her in ways she was still understanding. She was no longer Emily Carter, the quiet nurse who hid from her own potential. But she wasn't quite Sarah Mitchell either, the operative who had lived in shadows and secrets. She was something new, something that combined the best of both identities, forged in the fire of revelation and tempered by the choice to fight for truth instead of hiding from it. Logan joined her, his injuries finally healed, his own testimony complete. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. After everything they had been through, they had earned the right to simply exist together, to breathe the same air, to contemplate a future that was finally their own to create. The fight wasn't over, not completely. There would always be those who preferred shadows to light, who believed that power justified any action. But for now, in this moment, the truth had won, and that was something worth celebrating. Emily took Logan's hand, feeling the warmth of his fingers intertwined with hers. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as operatives bound by protocol, but as partners chosen by something deeper than duty. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in that vast expanse, new stories were beginning. New challenges were forming. New opportunities for courage and compassion and connection. But that was tomorrow. Tonight was for gratitude, for survival, for the simple, profound miracle of being alive. And as they walked together into the gathering evening, Emily smiled. Not the guarded smile of someone hiding her true self, but the genuine expression of a woman who had finally found her way home. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Emily and Logan has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore courage, identity, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us. You can find it right here by clicking on your left side. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every single day, we bring you unique narratives that explore the complexity of the human experience, the power of truth, and the resilience of the human spirit. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which moment touched you the most? Have you ever had to fight to reclaim something precious that was taken from you? Share your thoughts with us. Your stories matter just as much as the ones we tell. Don't miss our upcoming content. We'll be waiting for you in the next chapter of this journey we share together.